Hi all, my name is Andre and this is my channel about economics and economic history. Today, as I mentioned in the video about how governments print money, we're going to talk about the national debt of the United States. Why did I decide to choose and study this topic? Because there's a lot of buzz around it, some kind of chatter about how the US economy is coming to an end soon, that everything is going to be really bad. Have you seen their national debt? Look at bad everything is for them. In fact, this is not quite true, and we will discuss this today. Let's remember that almost any developed economy runs a deficit, meaning they spend more than they earn. And this gap must be filled. It must be covered somehow with the money that's lacking, and governments most often go into debt because you can't just print money like that. Make sure to check out my video about me printing money to find out why. There are several types of debts, external and internal. You can borrow from your own citizens, you can borrow from banks, and you can borrow from other countries. The US national debt currently stands at over $34 trillion, which seems like completely or astronomical figures. But in this context, you shouldn't look at the whole story like that. It's more accurate to look at the debt to GDP ratio, and for the US, it's not that catastrophic. It stands at 144%. That's it. A year of economic life plus more. It's about 4 or 5 months. It's not that much and not that scary. Japan has the largest national debt in the world, standing at 254%. That's much higher than in the States. And if the entire economy needs to be directed towards paying off the debt, then of course Japan will need a lot more time. What's interesting, by the way, that Japan is the largest holder of US debt, given that they themselves have a very large national debt. Let's talk a little bit about the history of national debt. In general, where did it come from? How did it come about? Why did it appear? And what is it needed for? It all started with the War for Independence. The states against Great Britain, 13 states signed the Declaration of Independence and created a new nation, which we now know, like the United States of America, which now has not 13 states but 50. But I won't go into the history of the conflict or the origins of the state. Let's talk about national debt. It was there from the very first day of the state's existence. Why? It's simple. It was war. They had to fight against a great empire, against Britain, which at that time was one of the most powerful empires. And they had to find a way to pay for all of this, to fund, to pay the soldiers' salaries. And that's quite difficult. It's expensive. Not all countries can afford a war. So, how did the economy of the young country was struggling with the fact that there wasn't enough money. The young country created its own currency to be able to issue it, that is, to print it. And considering that it wasn't backed by anything, there was high inflation in the country. Moreover, money was borrowed from other countries. France played the biggest role in this story because they had their own conflict with Britain, and they sponsored and lent to the United States of America. There were taxes and fees, well, loans and debts, of course. So, in fact, the entire history of the United States is accompanied by national debt. So it has always been there, and it is still here now. And considering that the US economy has been in deficit for at least the last 20 years, it has always been that way. The US gets involved in many wars. They have high expenses. In fact, national debt is a constant companion of the country. So, after the War of Independence, the young nation had to find a way to pay off the debts that had piled up, especially in the northern states. And then Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the US, one of the founders of America, is worth mentioning. It's worth making a separate video about him. He was quite a remarkable figure. He enacted the Public Credit Act, which was passed. It's worth making a separate video about him. He was quite a remarkable figure. He enacted the Public Credit Act, which was passed, about how the new government takes on the debts of all the states. It is noteworthy that in 1835, Andrew Jackson even paid off the national debt in full once, meaning this is the only time in history when the United States was completely debt-free. And it hasn't happened again since, and it's unlikely to happen again. At the moment, national debt is a constant companion of the states, and it will continue like this, most likely always. And there's nothing wrong with that. Many countries live this way, and this won't kill the US, as many think. Let's briefly talk about who holds the US national debt and how it's distributed. So, for the most part, the US debt is owned by the US itself. It's the Federal Reserve and various agencies They account for 39.5% of the debt. Another 24.4% is held by other countries. As I said, the largest holder of US government debt is the Japanese, Japan, with 1.1 trillion in debt. The remaining 36.1% of the debt is distributed among various investors, individuals, mutual funds, banks, local governments, and the states of the US, pension funds, insurance funds, and regular working folks, everyday individuals, people like us. So why does the national debt keep growing? The debt ceiling is reached. It grows for reasons. The debt ceiling has been reached, and supposedly everything is bad. There are several reasons why it is growing. The first reason is, of course, wars. US has started, well, it probably starts, or will start many wars, unfortunately. And it's quite an expensive endeavor. Only on companies in Iraq and Afghanistan, approximately $2.2 trillion was spent. The second important reason for the growth of the national debt is, of course, the crises that have been happening quite frequently lately. For example, the same crisis of 2008, the big mortgage crisis, which also needs to be addressed. And I will definitely make a separate video on this topic. But back then, the government spent $1.5 trillion to slightly save the situation. The economy only managed to stabilize in 2013. This is even gloomier, because due to the crisis, tax revenues are falling, the economy is in recession, the economy is stagnating, and expenses can also rise. Some expenses or staying at the same level is difficult. Another example of such a crisis is the COVID crisis, because during COVID, there were massive amounts of helicopter money injected into the economy. The US then injected $4.2 trillion into the economy, and now we are experiencing. There are big consequences with high inflation in the States and around the world in general. Right now, we're paying the price for those decisions, so to speak. And one of the last reasons is tax breaks. For example, from 2017 to 2027, the US will miss out on $1.5 trillion in budget revenue because the former president of the United States, and possibly the next president as well, Donald Trump, introduced certain tax breaks. A distinctive feature of the US national debt is the debt ceiling. So its ceiling is the debt limit. It's a cap needing agreement to raise that the government issues. So it's some amount above which they can't go. They need to agree on a new ceiling. The US has its own specific system, meaning that Congress has to negotiate. They need to come to an agreement. Democrats and Republicans often struggle to even agree on raising it. This is frequently a subject of disputes because one side demands this while the other side demands that. So, for example, last year, the Republicans demanded cuts in spending to raise the national debt, and they can negotiate for a very long time. And this will lead to the so-called shutdown. That is when, in fact, the activities of the state, the civil service, and so on are being reduced. Perhaps one could call this a default in some sense, but probably not. Overall, in US history, there have been 3 defaults for various reasons. The first was during the war with the British back in the 19th century. The second was the departure from the gold standard. And the third was due to a technical glitch, and they failed to pay some debts. The ministry was moving, and they couldn't pay off some debts. Some debts, in general, it's more of a technical issue. But what if they can't come to an agreement? That the government can still save itself. First of all, they might be able to scrape together some extra money, so to speak. This has happened before. So the government, due to Cromwell, found some extra funds and saved itself. To use the 14th Amendment. The president can use it and bypass Congress. It could be politically costly, but that option is there. The 14th Amendment states that the US debt is a sovereign matter. Basically, the amendment protects the national debt and states that it must exist and be serviced. Another option could be an extension on loan payments. That is, all this is discussed, agreed upon, deadlines can be pushed back, we can work with it. You can also cut expenses, reduce costs, and survive on the budget for a while longer. There's a very interesting populist theory that you could also mint a coin with a face value of $1 trillion and pay off all the debts. The topic is very strange, but for some reason, it has been gaining a lot of popularity lately, and interest in it is growing. There is such a thing that the payment on the national debt used to be quite comfortable for the government. For the United States, in the sense that interest rates were low. For example, in January 2022, the Fed rate was 0.25%. The Fed rate is the rate at which banks borrow money. So the bank takes loans from the government and gives them to regular people. So the US had effectively free money back in 2022. The rate changes, but it has always been quite low in the States. So for some reason, many people can easily get a mortgage. They can live on credit because money, well, you don't have to overpay huge amounts for goods, for houses, for cars. You can simply live comfortably on credit, but now the rate is 55%, which is very high for the US. It's a very high interest rate. If before money was free, you could get mortgages, loans, buy cars, now it has become costly and less beneficial. The interest rate the government borrows money depends on the Fed rate. Anything has now become much more expensive and much less advantageous. The interest rate at which the government borrows money depends on the Fed rate. It's usually lower than, but it still equates to it. And the government is forced to borrow money at a higher interest rate. This is a problem because servicing the national debt becomes a very significant budget expense. And the money that could have gone to some expenses like hospitals, the military, or anything else will go to debt repayment. This is a problem, and right now in the US, people are especially worried about this whole situation because debt is just becoming expensive. And the last thing we'll talk about, can the national debt ultimately destroy the US economy? The dollar, the end, everything will collapse. Everything will sink and it will be very bad. In fact, the likelihood of that is as low as it can be. Why? Because the US national debt is the only national debt in the world that is external and denominated in its own currency. That is, if, for example, Russia misses out its debt in rubles, both domestic and external, for example, in dollars or yuan. Dollars are unlikely, well, let's say yuan. Or then if it will need to be urgently closed, for some reason the government can't just print money. How money is printed, I've already talked about it. Be sure to check out the video. So it can't just take on yuan. Unlike rubles, the government can raise inflation by 5 rubles but still pay off its debts. Part of the yuan, Russia can't do that. If needed, they can issue needed dollars. It will cause inflation but not collapse the state. Everyone takes it in dollars. Economically, it will have its consequences, high inflation and so on, but it will not kill the state. That's the difference with the national debt because everyone takes it in dollars. So they have their internal currency in dollars and their external debt in dollars. That's the strength of this national debt. And that's one of those important reasons why this won't do anything to the United States. So they will keep growing the national debt, keep raising the ceiling, and they'll feel just fine.